Hey guys, Steve here with the Scroll Saw Workshop. Went out into my shop today to process this beautiful piece of Peruvian walnut into some scroll saw ready boards. And I've had enough questions about this over the years that I thought I would just do a little slideshow here and show you what it takes in the way of tools and time and effort to turn these into some boards that we can use on the scroll saw. This board is approximately 6.5 board feet. As you can see here, it's 11 inches wide and it's just a little over 4/4 thick. So this is a pretty good sized board that we're going to be processing here, and it's going to take a little bit of time and a little thought on what types of scroll saw ready boards we want to get out of it. This board is what they call in the rough. It's not been surfaced on any of the edges, so we'll have to run it through all the tools to get it ready to go. Here's the clock in my shop at the time I started processing this board, and this will give you an idea of how long it's going to take us to complete this pretty good sized task. Also, in this slideshow, I'm not going to spend hardly any time talking about technique on each of the steps of this process. This is more just to show you what it takes to make these boards ready. I'm going to be processing this lumber down into pieces that we can use on the scroll saw. And because of that, most of the boards are going to be fairly small. The techniques that I use to decide on what sizes these are going to be are different than if you were to process this board for furniture. So keep that in mind as we go along. To make this piece of lumber more manageable and easier to move around my small shop, I'm going to use my circular saw to cut it close to in half, and that'll make it a lot easier to get through my planer. If we were going to process this lumber for furniture, you would typically want to run one face of this over a jointer first to get one flat edge. But in this case, we're processing it, like I said, for the scroll saw, and it's not as critical. So I'm just going to take it straight to the planer. Here are the boards after I've run them through the planer. Took several passes. All I was trying to do here was to get the surface roughness taken care of. I wasn't trying to come down to a specific thickness like you might normally on a planer. I actually wanted to keep as much material as possible, so all I did was run it through the planer enough times until each surface was smooth. I do need to get one edge of the board flat because I'm going to need a flat edge to run it against the fence on my table saw. So both boards take a trip over to the joiner, and we're going to get one good flat square edge. We're going to be resawing these boards into thinner boards over at the bandsaw. So to do that, I need both edges to be flat. So both boards get a trip to the table saw. We're going to do a trim cut on the side opposite that we just jointed. We're just going to take off 1/8 of an inch, just enough to give us another flat surface. We're at the point now where we need to start making some decisions on what sizes and thicknesses of boards we want to get out of this lumber. And again, remembering that we're processing this for the scroll saw, I want some thin boards. So I use a lot of 1/4 inch thick boards, so I'm going to process at least half of it, if not more, into that thickness. I'm also going to leave one of them at the original 4/4 inch thickness because we can use that for some thicker projects. And then I think I'll get a little bit of 1/2 inch thick and maybe one piece of 1/8 inch thick material out of this. Okay, the boards are going to take another trip back over to the table saw. I don't need very long boards for my scroll saw project, so I'm going to cut these down. I'm going to cross cut them down into 4 or 5 separate boards. It'll make it easier for me to get them through the bandsaw when we start resawing, and I'm not going to need them any longer than that anyway. So let's cut them down. I got the boards cut down into 5 individual pieces, and I've made the decision that I'm going to take 3 of these and resaw them exactly in half, and I'm going to get 6 pieces of 1/4 inch thick walnut out of those boards. I'm going to take one of the boards and leave it at the original thickness of 4/4, and the last board I'm going to resaw it into just the size that I need to get a 1/2 inch thick board and a 1/8 inch thick board out of it. Because of the way I like to resaw boards, I like to draw a line on one edge that I can follow over at the bandsaw. So on these boards where I want to get 2 1/4 inch sections out of them, I'm going to draw a line right down the middle of the board. Now, it'd be better if I used a white marker for this, but I can see the black line, but you're going to have a little harder time seeing the pencil line. But trust me, there's a pencil line drawn down the center of the board. I just make a mark at each end of the board, then use a straight edge to connect the marks to get my line. All the boards are marked, ready to head over to the bandsaw, except for the one board that I've set aside to keep full thickness. You might be wondering why, if this board is 1 inch thick, I'm going to only get 2 1/4 inch pieces out of it. And that's because we're going to cut this board in half, and the kerf is going to take away some of the board, and we might be able to get a 3/8 inch piece out of it, but I don't use 3/8 too much, so I'm just going to take it right down to a 1/4. So here I've got the board marked in half. That's where we're going to resaw this one. And to be able to get the 1/2 inch thick and the 1/8 inch thick board, we're going to take this board and mark it off center a little bit. Now, a board this wide, this board's at this point about 10 3/4 inches wide. It's fairly easy when you're resawing to not get a straight cut. So sometimes when you're going to try to get a 1/8 inch thick board out of it, you might struggle a little bit. So you have to be pretty careful over at the bandsaw. Just want to double check to make sure the blade's 90 degrees to the table. We don't want to have crooked cuts. So I've got my machinist square set up next to the blade, just making sure everything's set up correctly before we start. Got the board on the bandsaw. We've begun the resaw process. Let me talk about bandsaws just for 1 second. If you plan to process lumber that is this wide, you need a bandsaw that's capable of doing that. In this case, my bandsaw has a resaw capacity of 12 inches, so I've got enough room, and I think it's a 3/4 horsepower motor, so it's got enough power to cut through this board. You also want to use the correct resaw blade in your bandsaw. Resaw blades typically have fewer teeth per inch. In this case, I think it's a 4 TPI blade I've got in this thing. So you need this bandsaw set up right to process a board this wide. If you have a benchtop bandsaw, you won't have the resaw capacity to resaw a board this wide. So you're going to need to rip the boards down to the dimensions that your bandsaw can handle. Also, a lot of the benchtop bandsaws will really struggle in power. So if you plan on doing a lot of resawing of your own lumber, it's really advisable to try to save up and get a decent bandsaw that has the capacity to cut these thick boards. I finished the resaw of all 3 of the boards that we're going to try to get the 1/4 inch thicknesses out of, and now I'm moving over to the board that we drew the line offset a little bit. This is where you have to be a little bit more careful. If you get a cut that's not 90 degrees to the table, this 1/8 inch thick board can come out very uneven, and you may not be able to plane it down to the 1/8 inch thickness. So this is the area where you really have to use good resaw technique. You definitely want to have a nice resaw blade to cut these thinner materials, and you want to go slow and let the blade do the cutting. Here's where we are so far. We've got our rough thicknesses done now over at the bandsaw with the resawing. Now we need to take the boards down to their final thickness, and we're going to do that back over at the planer. Got the boards back over at the planer, and this time we actually do want to plane down to a specific thickness as opposed to when we were just surfacing the boards the first time through. So we'll be setting the depth stop on the planer to the 1/4 inch thick for those boards. Of course, the 1/2 inch for it, and the 1/8 inch thick for that final thin board. All the boards will be pushed through the planer one right after the other to help reduce the amount of snipe on the end of the board. We'll process these boards several passes, and on the final pass or two I will turn the speed of the planer down a little bit to get a finer cut. This particular lunchbox style planer has 2 speeds, and the faster speed actually gives you a smoother surface, so that's how we're going to do it. We ended up with 9 boards out of that 6.5 board foot piece of Peruvian walnut. Here's what we've got. Let's look at the dimensions. First board here is 1/8 inch thick, 10.75 inches wide, and 17.25 inches long. Here's the board that we did not change the thickness of. It's 4/4 thick by 10.7 inches wide and 19 inches long. We ended up with 6 of these 1/4 inch thick boards, and they ranged from 15 inches up to about 18 inches in length. Here's a shot of the clock right after I finished running the last board through the planer for its final thickness. So you can see processing this board took a little over an hour. That time doesn't include the shop cleanup afterwards. Probably took me another 30 minutes to clean up. You can see here's the cyclone bucket. This bucket was probably 1/4 full when I started this job, and it's about 3/4 full now. So you can see we created quite a bit of sawdust. Okay, so we're all finished up now. Was all this time and effort worth the money? Let's talk about that for a second. This 6.5 board foot, actually was a little under 6.5 board foot of Peruvian walnut, cost me about $45. I think I paid $7 a board foot, which is a decent price. If you go online and look at a typical reseller of scroll saw ready boards, you'll see that a 1/4 inch thick by 10 inch wide by 24 inch long piece of walnut would run you around about $16.25, plus that board would cost you about $13 in shipping. So if you added the total up of all these boards we got out of this 6.5 board foot, you're looking at between $130 and $140 in value. So not too bad. We took $45. I think it was actually $45.50 what I paid for it, and we turned it into $140 to $150, and it took us about an hour to do it. So you can see that if you have the tools already available, then buying lumber in the rough and making your own scroll saw ready boards is way more economical than trying to buy them online. But of course you've got the price of all these tools, which if you had to go out and purchase these tools, you'd have to process a lot of lumber before you could pay off what you spent on these tools. So it just depends on where you're at in your woodworking life, whether you already have the tools or whether you want to spend the time to invest in those tools. Okay, that's it for today. I'm Steve Good. Thanks for being here with me at the Scroll Saw Workshop. Catch you next time.